I've always been fascinated by race since I was a kid, since I saw an Aboriginal pass or an Aboriginal family pass my front gate in Campsie, New South Wales. An interest in race, I think, is there in a number of my books. These remarks on race are condensed from the new volume of A History of Australians, and I offer them not in the sense of tusk, how silly we were, not primarily in that sense, but white Australia was a delusion. The whiteness issue occupied Australians from the beginning, as indeed it occupied most Caucasians the world over. But the Australians had a special problem. Northern Australia was considered an unfit territory for European women, a zone of degeneracy and fever. Metropolitan Australia harboured a considerable anxiety about what was happening up there and the dangers of tropical Australia becoming Mongrelia and piebald Australia. The Palmer River goldfield near Cooktown would attract 1,000 Chinese a week during the autumn of, if they have autumn up there, of 1874. Rhetoric dealt with the Asian as inferior, but also dangerous. In 1874, the South Australian government had entered a contract with the Netherlands East India Steam Navigation Company to include Darwin on their route to China. And this created further editorialising and concern. And the Cooktown Courier declared, "In a very short time, the Great Wall of China will encircle the Palmer, and the outer barbarian, the poor miner, will have to look for fresh fields." And an editorial in the Northern Miner in 1877 pushed the normal would-be scientific line that Kanakas and Chinese are distinct types of the genus Homo. Some would go so far as to deny that they belong to the human family at all. The Ingham Hospital had a sign at that stage which I thought particularly interesting. It excluded from its admittance, it said, 1, an African because he is black, a Malay because he is an Asiatic, a native of New Caledonia because he's a South Sea Islander. One of the chief threats Asia posed was not only to prosperity, but to racial purity. If Europeans were the highest form of humanity, any erosion of whiteness was a sort of lesion. William Lane, the great Labour leader and editor of The Boomerang in Brisbane and prophet of the strike of the 1890s, who then tried to find a new Australia in Paraguay, a very interesting story, declared in 1888 that he'd rather see his daughter dead in her coffin than kissing a black man on the mouth or nursing a little coffee-coloured brat that she was mother to. The priest Julian Tennyson Woods, a geologist, friend of the new Australian saint, Mary Potter, would write in 1886 warning Australians that after a geological expedition of his what was happening up there, and saying, I say we will one day regret any supremacy we give them, the Chinese. Cairns was considered a disgraceful town where white men ate with Chinese, slept with Japanese prostitutes who'd been recruited from Nagasaki, and let themselves be outwitted at the gambling table by the Chinese. States had already passed race exclusion acts before 1901, but in the first year of federal legislation, the new federal parliament looked to achieve as soon as possible a white Australia, and they passed in September that year an Immigration Restriction Act aimed at ending the Asian presence and a Pacific Islanders Labourers Act. The federal parliamentarians had overwhelming support for their laws concerning race, including and especially from Labor members. It's 22 members led by the handsome Chris Watson, handsome rugby-playing Chris Watson, who would later become Prime Minister. Alfred Deakin, Attorney General, the first speaker in the immigration restriction debate, remarkable Victorian Alfred Deakin, declared that the Commonwealth did not want to offend foreigners, did not argue racial superiority, but it was purely a matter of protecting the equity of white Australians in their country. Deakin confessed to an intellectual interest in Buddhism and Hinduism, but he said he wanted to avoid for Australians the poverty he'd seen in India when he was there studying immigration. Deakin argued that the Chinese and Japanese immigrants to Australia were the lesser members of their race, the least educated. Yet there were, above all and perhaps contradictorily, grounds for excluding the Japanese, quotes, because of their high abilities. The Japanese are the most dangerous because they most nearly approach us and would therefore be our most formidable competitors. There was also the issue of finding a community that had shared values, said Deakin. The unity of Australia is nothing if that does not imply a united race. A united race means not only that its members can intermix, intermarry and associate without degradation on either side, but implies one inspired by the same ideas and an aspiration towards the same ideals. These are the last person I heard invoking ideals was Julia Gillard the day after a man in a detention centre hanged himself for the Commonwealth value of mandatory detention. But underlining the question of exclusion of Asians from Australia was the problem that Britain devoutly desired friendship with Japan. It had concluded a trade treaty with Japan in the 1890s, and Chamberlain, the British Secretary for the Colonies, warned the Australians in 1897 at a conference they attended that to exclude by reason of their colour or by reason of their race all Her Majesty's Indian subjects, or even all Asiatics, would be an act so offensive to those people that it would be most painful to Her Majesty to have to sanction it. There was in that first Australian Parliament members who wanted to try to accommodate the British by an indirect method of excluding undesirable races, and they came up with the dictation test. A method that did not explicitly invoke racial difference, but was based on the immigrants' ignorance of English or some other European language. British immigrants, of course, did not have to sit for the test. It was the immigration officials, it was their prerogative to set it. John Forrest from Western Australia and a number of others thought that Chamberlain's directions about race were in any case imperial impudence and ought to be ignored, letting the Japanese think whatever they chose to about us. The government, as I said, chose ultimately the dictation test method. The Asian presence in much of northern Australia would continue for some years, and Japanese divers continued to work in tropical Australia. The young Commonwealth brought in British divers in 1911 to try to replace them. There were Royal Navy divers. but this recruitment was a catastrophe because 3 of the unfortunate British divers died at the bends, and the others cleared out to Broome in protest. A twin to the Immigration Restriction Act was the Pacific Island Labourers Act, by which Kanakas, the indentured labourers from the South Seas, would be returned to their home islands. Many, or a number, as Queensland Police combed the countryside for Kanakas, had associations with Aboriginal wives and Aboriginal Kanaka families, and hid from the police and remained, but there was a consistent program of return of the Kanakas. At the apogee of White Australia, there was the shock that Japan defeated in fact, virtually destroyed the Russian Navy in the Straits of Tsushima in 1905. And since the British had signed a naval treaty with the Japanese, a conviction grew that the new federation must acquire its own navy. The treaty bespoke a certain uneasiness as to whether Britain would or could hold the Japanese in the northern Pacific. And the Japanese began to become frightening not only for their race, but also for their ambitions. Australian concern generated a popular book by a man called C.H. Kermis that I read during the writing of Volume 2, and it was about how Kermis was an Anglo-Australian newspaper man called Frank Ignatius Fox, and he was a friend of Deacon's, and he talked about the Japanese invading northern Australia and the Downing Street being in the situation of having to choose between its colonies and its friendship with Japan, and becoming dilatory to the extent that the only force that stood up to the Japanese was an Australian White Guard. The Australian White Guard was ultimately defeated due to British lack of reaction, defeated by the Japanese, and British and Australian women bred with the invaders and begot little brown babies, wrote Kermis. You'd think it'd be little yellow babies, but there you go. Of all the reasons noble and human that Australia participated in the Great War, the War of 1914-18, by its end, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, knew that one of them was white Australia. And he took that passion with him into the Paris Peace Conference, and he opposed the Covenant Committee's desire to pass unanimously a racial equality clause. He wrote, applied to Australia, it meant that Japanese might enter our country when and to the extent they desired. Our white Australia policy would be a pricked bladder. Hughes was visited by the Japanese Foreign Minister, Baron Makino, who urged a recognition by Australia of the equality principle, and told him that both Lord Cecil of England and General Smuts of South Africa were willing to vote for the clause. But Hughes said England and Africa are different from us. Africa was already a coloured man's country, he said. Australia, on the other hand, is very much a white man's country, sparsely populated by white men. Hughes lobbied the American press to defeat the measure, particularly Californian pressmen covering the peace treaty, because Californian pressmen were worried about the Japanese in California. Hughes said he would give place to none in my respect and goodwill and esteem for the Japanese nation. But he said, just as he wouldn't interfere in Japanese internal matters. The Japanese should not interfere with ours. But that racial equality clause was, which would probably ultimately be more honoured in the breach than the observance, was defeated, according to President Wilson's chief aide, Colonel House, he put most of the blame on Hughes. Hughes wanted the precise terms of the mandates over the Pacific islands concluded, and particularly Australia's mandate over New Guinea, and he said that the territorial integrity of our country and the White Australia policy, which is the cornerstone of our national edifice, was in serious danger unless they could guarantee this buffer of islands between mainland White Australia and the Japanese ambition. Hughes was asked by Wilson whether Australia and New Zealand were giving the conference an ultimatum, and whether the 5 million people of Australia and New Zealand were standing up and threatening the 1,200 million represented at the conference. And Hughes replied, that's just about that. And he thumped the table and said, I represent 60,000 dead. And on that basis, mandates for Australia were given, but also mandates that worried both America and Australia in the North Pacific to the Japanese. After World War I, the base at Singapore, the British base at Singapore, which was largely unoccupied for great stretches of time, was designed to guarantee the security of Australia, and the idea was that it would be a pledge to us which allowed us to continue as a safe white dominion. We entered World War II on the Empire side again for many reasons, but one was the belief that the Royal Navy, which was in greater decline than either the British or we were willing to admit, would protect white Australia from Japanese ambitions. Churchill did, a very clever man, of course. He was capable of sleight of hand, and he put up this Heath-Robinson proposition, which is that we would contribute troops to the war in the Northern Hemisphere, and in return, if the Japanese struck in the Pacific, Singapore would be fortified. It was a little bit suspicious that he refused to send modern Hurricane fighters to Singapore, but Menzies assured his cabinet anyhow that the Japanese would be too scared of increasing American penetration of the Pacific to take us all on. This was the proposition, this stick and carrot, that if you participate in what we ask you to, we will look after you from Singapore. This was the deal that was done over Greece, a terrible military catastrophe, right up there with Gallipoli, and designed not for military results, but to impress President Roosevelt and help bring him into the war. So the Australians were sent to Greece, and Menzies hoped it would really shake the American tree and ultimately ensure protection from then as well. And when Japan did enter the war and advance down its archipelagos, Singapore, of course, proved a another delusion, and the sentence in Curtin's famous radio broadcast that Churchill nonetheless found particularly insulting was the sentiment, "without any inhibition of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links of kinship with the United Kingdom." Churchill sent a message of chastisement to Curtin, which declared that Britain and the United States would have a primary role in deciding Pacific strategy, and it was not up to Churchill to decide who would look to whom for protection. A number of Australian Conservatives shared Churchill's fury. They still believed absolutely in Malaya, that in Malaya the Japanese racial inferiority would ensure that they would be defeated. As a little kid, I remember the stories going round Homebush, that eminent target of Japanese imperialism. Homebush, New South Wales, a suburb, well, where the Olympics later occurred. People saying, well, they've all got short sight and they can't shoot, so Singapore is safe. Even when we were in great danger then, in the hour of peril, white Australia still asserted itself. The governor of Singapore asked us to give refuge to 5,000 Singaporeans displaced by Japanese invasion of the Malayan mainland. He declared himself shocked when we admitted only 50 Chinese and 50 Eurasia. Singapore fell, and Asia, in its ugliest militarist form, kicked the door in, and things would never be the same, though we didn't know it then. At the end of the war, the empire reasserted itself, in some places for long periods, in other places for short periods, but there were post-war omens that you can see now of the end of white Australia, the marriage between Australian troops in the occupation of Japan and Japanese women, the Colombo Plan, which brought Asian students to Australia, trade with Japan and Asia generally, growing diplomatic commitment. We wanted to retain white Australia while engaging in this process of making friends in Asia. But white Australia was inevitably eroded and was dead by the 1970s. The end of white Australia came without the breakdown of society foretold by Geoffrey Blainey, a great historian, or trumpeted more hysterically, well, I don't know about more hysterically, but trumpeted by Hanson. The concept of miscegenation as a force for social and genetic degradation is now patently ridiculous. But for so many decades of our history, it was a fundamental principle of our society, something that had to be held on to in the last stockade of principles that we occupied before we were swamped, one on which we spent our best efforts and which we considered organic to our identity. So potent a force was it, right up until I was a fetching little auburn-haired child of 7 running around Campsie, New South Wales. So potent a force that one wonders if there is an overriding principle or set of principles that is dominating us at the moment, which we take for granted yet cannot see through. A principle or set of principles which are as unnecessary to our national project now as white Australia proved to be eventually. Thank you.